Today we're talking about the Articles of Confederation, which is not something we cover very often, not nearly enough. And today in history, here from Dave Benner's article we published this morning on March 1st, 1781, the states adopted the Articles of Confederation, putting into operation the first constitution for the United States. And again, Dave points out that it's interesting that they were actually adopted a little bit before that, but they went into effect today in history on March 1st. I'll get to that in a moment. He said the articles went unratified for several years, mainly due to various disputes between the states. In 1781, however, Maryland, which was the final holdout on this, finally assented to the plan and effectively put the Articles of Confederation into motion after a series of concessions between the states. Basically, once it was sent from Congress to the states for ratification consideration, almost everybody, well, basically everybody but Maryland ratified pretty quickly. But between 1779, February of 1779, and February of 1781, all the states but Maryland ratified, and the Continental Congress pretty much observed the Articles of Confederation as the de facto constitution for the United States anyways. But then Congress was informed that Maryland had ratified in February of 1781, and then today in history, they made it official as the law of the land. And I'm going to get to that a little bit more in just a moment. But first of all, I think it's important to kind of address the question, why should we care about the Articles of Confederation? Why is it of importance, whether we think that's a better document or a worse document, or whether we want to learn about the Constitution or whatever we're doing here? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that in a lot of situations, if you want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution for the United States, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to have a good understanding if you have absolutely no clue about the Articles of Confederation. You don't have to be an expert in it. I definitely am not, and I probably would like to at some point. But a lot of the ratification debates reference specific issues, clauses, and powers in relationship to the Articles of Confederation and didn't actually spell that out for people. Everyone understood what they were talking about. Things like requisitions versus direct taxation. The Articles did not have any power delegated to Congress, to the federal government, to the government of the United States, or Congress in the United States assembled is how they call it. They didn't have a power of direct taxation. So that's a good example that I'll get to in just a moment. Brian McClanahan probably does some of the best work on this in his podcast, and I'm going to link to an old episode of his that we republished over here at TAC some while ago. And he said there are several points to understand about the Articles and its relationship to the United States Constitution. Here's a few. One, the union of the states under the Articles was made more perfect, but was not altered, meaning the union under the Constitution was still a union of states and not one people, not one singular blob. Two, he points out that the Articles clarified that the last paragraph in the Declaration was not simply legal filler. Jefferson fully meant that the states were free and independent with full sovereignty. The people of those states held sovereignty or final authority. And three, Brian points out, federalism is the key to the American political system. I think this is all the way back in episode 63. Episode 63. I will link to that in the show notes. It's back from February 2018, and I think you'll enjoy that episode. Anyways, back to Dave Benner. Here are some highlights of a number of the defining characteristics of the Articles of Confederation. Of course, again, way more federalism than what we have today, and no direct taxation, which I'll get to again. First, Dave writes, under the Articles, each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in a confederation of state republics. And this is a lot of what Brian was getting into when he was doing that overview for the podcast I just mentioned. Dave says, in an unmistakable embrace of federalism, a citizen's connection to his home state remained the most basic and most important relationship in the American political system. And I was doing some research recently about the views of some of the anti-federalists, after the Bill of Rights was proposed, the ball was rolling, and it was going to go for ratification. And two people who I was trying to actually dig into to try to find their views were Richard Henry Lee. This is the guy that in the Confederation Congress, once the Philadelphia Convention sent the Constitution to the Confederation Congress, before giving it a thumbs up and sending it off to states for ratification consideration, Richard Henry Lee worked very hard to try to get a Bill of Rights attached right off the bat. He didn't succeed at that. And one of the other people was Patrick Henry, who was adamantly opposed to adoption of the Constitution. He wanted a Bill of Rights. And I was actually really interested to see that both Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry were unhappy with what became the Bill of Rights, or this was in 1789, what they were going to be considering for ratification. Patrick Henry specifically said, looking at these amendments, it looks like it's more of a loss of liberty than anything. And I want to get into understanding that a little bit better. Richard Henry Lee, and this is where I was getting to with this, Dave's point about how people remained connected to their home state. That was their country, not the country, this one nation blob of the United States. It was these United States Confederated Republic. And Richard Henry Lee held that view even in 1789 after the Constitution had been adopted and after he had worked very hard. And he told Patrick Henry in a letter, he said, look, I worked really hard to get all the amendments that we recommended in our home country. So he was talking about Virginia as being their home country. And I thought that was an interesting piece there. And Dave, what he's talking about and what Brian was referencing here, this sovereignty, this is Article 2 from the Articles of Confederation. Of course, I'm going to link to this in the show notes so you can read it on your own time in full. But here's what it says, and it's very much a precursor to the 10th Amendment. It's actually more restrictive on federal power than what the 10th Amendment became, but each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. So anything that's not expressly delegated was reserved to each of the states. States, the people of those states. And the states, those state governments, of course, we know, those are emanations of power of the people as well. Dave also points out that there really was, there really was no executive or judicial branch. It was just going to be a legislative. And he said it was decided that the Confederation Congress would only assume the role of a legislature and that no executive or judicial branch would be created. There was not going to be no judiciary. Now, of course, there was a process in there for if there were disputes between the states, but it was really, Congress was more of a mediator working out how the states would resolve those problems. But that's maybe for another episode. If you guys are really into this Articles of Confederation stuff, maybe I can get into some more details. Dave points out that executive power would reside in the executives of the state governments only, and the judicial authority would remain in the state courts. There, in and of itself, you can see how it's a far more federal system, much more federalism than even what we have today. And here's a biggie that I keep mentioning. Rather than a system of direct taxation, and this is even before the idea of an individual income tax, direct taxation, there's still direct taxation in the original body of the Constitution. We also have Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation. The amount, of course, everyone recognized that the government, if it was going to do anything, and now I know there's going to be people here in this audience who would rather have them do nothing, and I guess even if there should do 10% of the stuff they do or 2%, getting it 90% or 98% right is probably way better than what we have right now anyways in practice. But the amount of money that was going to be paid to actually fund the general government, United States in Congress assembled, was to be paid by each state in proportion to the value, and I'm reading from Article 8, in proportion to the value of all land within each state. So from time to time, Congress assembled would just do a survey of the value of the land of each state, and then they would do a math calculation, and based on how, if they needed $1 million, if you had 24% of all the land value, you would owe 24% of that amount. And this was called a requisition system because they would put the amount out there, and then they would go to the states, and then the states would have to come up with a way to collect that money. And that's how Dave puts it. From there, the states would enact laws to raise the funds in ways that were conducive to their own constitutional systems. This arrangement for raising funds became known as the requisition system. And during the debates over ratification of the Constitution some years later, most people despised this requisition system. This was one of the big reasons why supporters of more general power, more centralized power in comparison to the Articles, was one of the reasons. Okay, Congress can't do what they're trying to do. We can't get any money. And they were, I think, in a way, they were probably hyping the problem more than it was, even if you considered it a problem. But most people were actually against it. And I only learned recently that, well, here, a quick aside. I did another episode covering some of Patrick Henry's ratification debate speeches, his anti-federalist speeches, and I'm going to pick up on those again in the near future. But I did some research at that point, and I found out that from the years 1782 to 1788, we find some stats of how much the states paid based on this requisition system. On the low end, it was about 25%. So if Congress asked for $1 million, they got $250,000. On the high end, it was about 48%. So on the highest end, the federal or the Congress got no more than 50% of what they were asking for. And that was for those who wanted the government to do the stuff that they want government to do. That's a huge problem. These days, of course, they fire up the money printer, and they're not limited by a hard value. They just fire up the money printer, and they get us through devaluing our purchasing power. So that's a different story. Now, some people, prominently Patrick Henry, I think I haven't really found many others. And if you guys are doing research on this stuff, I'd love to hear anything that you find as well, because I'm really still learning this particular part of it. That almost everyone's against the requisition system. They wanted a system of direct taxation. Patrick Henry, though, was totally in favor of requisitions. He thought this was a huge improvement. And here he is in his Virginia Ratifying Convention speech, June 7th, 1788. He said, "Requisitions, which gentlemen affect to despise," even there in Virginia, most of them were despising the requisition system. He said, "they have nothing degrading in them. On this depends our political prosperity." So their freedom, the liberty, the strength of the people of Virginia relied heavily upon the requisition system. Without it, they're more like Patrick Henry thought they would be more like a vassal state, like a large corporation or a large county. And maybe he was right in that warning. And it really got me thinking as I read through this again. He said, "I will never give up that darling word requisitions. My country may give it up." Here he is again referring to Virginia as his country. "A majority may wrest it from me, but I will never give it up till my grave." Why? Requisitions, he said, are attended with one singular advantage. They are attended by deliberation. They secure to the states the benefit of correcting oppressive errors. Think about that. If the government is trying to tax everybody, the central government, the federal government, general government, whatever you want to call it, is trying to tax people, and they say, okay, well, we want to do this program, this program, this program. Of course, they only can get away with it if by ripping people off, forcing people to get in this system, even if they don't want to be. But Patrick Henry was recognizing here that if the general government wanted to do something and the states were not on board, even if it was just a single state, well, at least they wouldn't have to, as Thomas Paine put it, and he was not citing Paine here, but as Paine put it at the beginning of Common Sense in 1776, when they're taking your money to do stuff that you don't want them to do, you have to be reminded of the fact that you furnish the means by which you suffer. Again, they are attended by deliberation. They secure to the states the benefit of correcting oppressive errors. If our assembly thought requisitions erroneous, said Patrick Henry, if they thought the demand was too great, they might at least supplicate them to reconsider that it was a little too much. And I like how he's a little bit more just middle of the road with that. So he saw requisitions as a way to check federal power in the states. Now, we don't have that system anymore, but that was one of the defining characteristics of the Articles of Confederation, and it's actually one of the defining reasons why it was scrapped. Here, back to Dave Benner, he said the approval of 9 out of 13 states, again, this is heavy on the federalism side. This is not pure federalism. It's a kind of a majority federalism. 9 out of 13 would be required to do almost anything of significance. So if Congress wanted to do things in certain areas, they could propose it. All they were doing was proposing stuff, And then it would be up to the states in the Confederation to say whether or not they were going to be on board. And if you didn't agree with it, and 9 out of 13 did, well, I guess you could just leave if you wanted to, but that was a different story. They would be required to do almost anything of significance. This requirement pertained to declaring war, borrowing money from foreign powers, entering into treaties, appointing a commander-in-chief, printing money, and several other functions. So you had to get approval from the states to do this. And here, this is from Article 9, I believe. Let me take a look. Scrolling. Yeah, Article 9 of the Articles of Confederation. Again, I will link to this in a moment. I'll mention where you can find all this stuff. The United States and Congress assembled shall never engage in a war, nor grant letters of marque or reprisal in time of peace, nor enter into any treaties or alliances, no treaties or alliances, nor coin money, nor regulate the value thereof, nor ascertain the sums and expenses necessary for the defense and welfare of the United States or any of them. And this is the list of the stuff that's specifically spelled out that they cannot do without the approval of 9 states. Even just coming up with the number that they were going to requisition, you had to get approval from 9 out of 13 states. Anyways, going further, nor emit bills, nor borrow money on the credit of the United States, nor appropriate money, nor agree upon the number of vessels of war to be built or purchased, or the number of land or sea forces to be raised, nor appoint a commander-in-chief of the Army or Navy, unless 9 states assent to the same. So there's a bunch of other stuff that Dave covers in his article talking about this more purely federal system. So I should mention that if you want to read that article, if you want to find the original text of the Articles of Confederation without going to some search engine that's spying on you, plus Brian McClanahan's blog and podcast, I'm going to include all of those in a link section, show link section, in a blog post that I publish about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done here. And I will publish that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Not only will you find all this stuff that I'm mentioning in this episode, I've got a couple of other episodes and articles that I'm going to cite here in just a moment, but you can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn and Twitter. Probably somebody else. We also live stream over at Odyssey.com and Rumble, and I know I had some errors on Monday's show with getting the live stream out in a couple of platforms, but hopefully that's fixed. And while we're here, while I'm at it, just going through this kind of quick side note, a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you guys being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Israel in Colorado, Kirk Morrison, Dixie Strong in Bama, Clay Kent over on Facebook. I guess that one's working. Good to see. Max Heffern. I'm not sure if I said Kirk Morrison, but if not, twice. Hello. Tim Martin in Arizona. White Space Marines is an awesome screen name. Melody Jones in Indiana. Magnolia Haji 54. Murray Ray, both in Michigan. Alt Reality. A lot of people here. Haji says, Dave Benner for the win. As always, Dave does such great, especially today in history blog posts and articles. We publish a lot of his stuff over here. Anyways, I know I'm missing a few people in the live chat, but I appreciate you all being here. If I get a chance later in the episode, I will read through some comments or questions. If not, I will read them later today or tomorrow and try to get back to them as soon as I can. Or if you've got great ideas for future episodes, or if you got a bad idea for a future episode, let me know. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyways, back to it. And again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find the show links section and the blog post that I'll publish here, I guess, probably around noon Pacific time. So you might be aware of the fact that the Articles of Confederation really went hand in hand with the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people just think these are just all happened in a vacuum. But on June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, and I'm reading from the overview of a blog covering an episode that I did on this a couple of years ago. Richard Henry Lee from Virginia introduced a resolution in the Second Continental Congress to declare independence, along with a call to form foreign alliances and a plan for confederation. So the Virginia's Fifth Revolutionary Convention, which happened just previous to that, they said, hey, we want our delegate to the Second Continental Congress to introduce this resolution. Richard Henry Lee, of course, obliged. He introduced this kind of threefer on June 7th. It was tabled at least for some debate, but on June 12th, a day after the appointing of the Committee of Five to prepare a draft for the Declaration of Independence, this is from Wikipedia, the Second Continental Congress resolved to appoint a committee of 13 with one representative from each colony to prepare a draft of a constitution for a union of the states. So here it is, July 7, 1776. We know Declaration of Independence, July 2nd, where the Lee Resolution was passed, July 4th, where we get the publication of the Declaration, August 1st, etc. But in between there, they start working on this plan of confederation. People like John Dickinson was very much pushing for, hey, we got to at least have a formal union here in order to be able to make this all play out if we're going to get the support we need to defeat these people. So a lot of people were really pushing for this. John Dickinson was named the chair of the committee. There are probably he's probably the primary author. We know the first draft is in his handwriting. He was the primary author and led that committee through the whole process. There's a few other people that you probably are familiar with, people like Samuel Adams, Robert Livingston. Maybe you know Thomas McKean in Delaware. There's also Roger Sherman. Some of the big names, they worked on this for quite some time. Now, Dickinson actually then, so we know the Lee Resolution passed on July 2nd. Then we get the Declaration on July 4th. July 12th, Dickinson presented the first draft of the Articles of Confederation to the Second Continental Congress. Mike Meharry has a really good article on this. I will link to it in the show notes again. Just like everything else, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Now, the committee that was chaired by Dickinson debated it for months. Now, mind you, the war is raging at this point, and Congress had to move a couple of times, and that slowed down the process, but there was some pretty heavy debate. And the Second Continental Congress finally approved the articles for distribution to the states for ratification consideration on November 15th, 1777. As I mentioned right at the beginning, all the states except Maryland actually ratified by February of 1779. And then it was kind of the de facto constitution for the United States, these Articles of Confederation, for the couple years until Maryland and then the Continental Congress made it official. They were disbanded on the same day they became the Confederation Congress. But anyways, this was also not the first proposal. So even though it was official that they were working on this, there had been other calls to create basically a confederation, a constitution for the United States. Earlier in the year, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine, of course, published Common Sense, which was the most widely read pamphlet document on American liberty ever. I mean, it had passed up the Letters from a Farmer of Pennsylvania, published in 1767 by Dickinson. It earned him the name, the penman of the Revolution, and then Paine kind of lit the fire. Now, in Common Sense, of course, we know he railed against the monarchical system, but he also outlined a very general outline of a plan for a charter of the United Colonies, where each state would be equal. A totally federal system is what Thomas Paine wanted. Now, mind you, this was the most popular document at that time, and everybody's reading this. The general public is pretty aware of it, and this is what Paine is calling for, and this is something that really sparked the resistance, the patriot side. And so if he's calling for a purely federal system, that was a pretty popular approach. He also called for a Congress with 390 delegates. I mean, this was going to be a very popular representative government. I did an episode on this that I will link to in the show notes as well, not just specifically on that, but on Thomas Paine's Common Sense, again, covering a lot of Dave Benner's work. And that was also not the first. The first official proposal for something specifically called the Articles of Confederation actually came from Benjamin Franklin. We look at James Madison as the so-called father of the Constitution. I have often referred to John Dickinson as the father of the Articles of Confederation, but we could also consider Benjamin Franklin the father of the Articles of Confederation as well. It's not a title many people probably would ever call him, but just months after the fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, here from another Meharry article, Franklin introduced his proposed Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union to the Second Continental Congress. This is July 21st, 1775. This is just weeks after the Congress turned down the offer from General Gage, give up your guns, give up your friends, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and we can have peace. So basically, supplicate yourself, bend the knees. Second Continental Congress said no deal. They passed the Declaration of the Causes for taking up arms. I know I have the title wrong on that, but that was authored by Jefferson and Dickinson. So just weeks later, Franklin's introducing this. Hey, we got to put this all together. He's one of the people that's saying if we really want to defeat these guys, we want to win, then we're going to have kind of a union to make us look stronger, for example. Now, it was an interesting time because still a lot of people, even though there was fighting breaking out, were still taking the position that maybe they could get reconciliation. Thomas Paine, of course, urged against that in December of 1776 because there were still people pushing for that. And he said you can have no reconciliation as long as they claim the power, and he's referencing the Declaratory Act of 1766, as long as they claim power over us in all cases whatsoever. It doesn't matter what deal they make. They still have unlimited power, and they're going to use it in a bad way in the future. So Franklin was still pushing for independence, really, here. Although Congress tabled Franklin's plan, it influenced the development of the Articles of Confederation the following year, as well as the Constitution for the United States. Mike writes that some of Franklin's proposals were adopted directly into the first draft of the Articles. That's John Dickinson's draft, including a common treasury and an executive council. Franklin was opposed to a unitary executive. He regaled people of the story of what went down in Pennsylvania during the ratification debates, or I think it was actually in the Philadelphia Convention he talked about this, where he specifically is like, look, the way it is, when you got this single person with so much power and the power of the veto, eventually it came down to the situation that if you wanted to get something passed, you'd have to grease the skids. You'd have to basically pay them off. And even though it kind of plays out like that today. Basically, they buy them all off and they just do what their backers say. Sometimes it's vice versa. But a common treasury and an executive council. Franklin warned even with the adoption or the proposed Constitution, he said the executive will always be increasing here, as is elsewhere, until it ends in a monarchy. So he did not like the structure of the executive branch that came out of the Constitution. Anyways, other ideas were not included, such as a formal amendment process and proportional representation in Congress. Proportional. That was, Mike's comparing Franklin's proposal in 1775 to the first draft of the Articles of Confederation. Now, I know we generally attribute the text of the preamble to the Constitution as being written by Gouverneur Morris. And, of course, the prose came from his writing. But if you compare what Benjamin Franklin proposed for the Articles of Confederation to the preamble for the Constitution for the United States, they've got some similar qualities. Let me just read Franklin's version. The said united colonies hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, binding themselves and their posterity for their common defense against their enemies, for the security of their liberties and properties, the safety of their persons and families, and their mutual and general welfare. So some similar language and a similar purpose and goal, because a preamble, now this was not officially a preamble, this was part of the articles that he had proposed, but a preamble, this is telling people the goal. This is why we have this thing. Now, Franklin had been working on this type of thing for decades. I mean, you can think even before the writs of assistance, even before the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, Franklin was pushing for greater cooperation between the colonies. And he had first, this is from the Bill of Rights Institute, Benjamin Franklin had first proposed the idea of an intercolonial government in 1751. And a month before the Albany Congress convened, this is 1754, he had published his famous Join or Die cartoon in the Pennsylvania Gazette. You can see up on the screen here, the Join or Die image. I've got that printed on a t-shirt that I'm wearing. Of course, you can find that over at shop.10thamendmentcenter.com. But anyways, the political cartoon, they point out, showed a snake cut into several pieces, which Franklin used to warn his readers about the dangers of division in the face of French encroachments on British claims to the Ohio Valley. Well, after that whole thing was done, 1763, then they realized that, the winners decided to go with a standing army, and that led to a bunch of other stuff. Here from Rod Nadelson, also talking about the Albany plan. It was actually, a lot of people, and I think even Rob mentioned this in his article, say that Franklin wrote this. I don't think that is actually correct. He actually wrote some notes, and then there were a lot of delegates, and his notes were kind of the foundation for it. So we can say that he drafted the Albany Plan in 1754, which is basically a confederation. Some of the plan's features foreshadowed the Articles of Confederation, Rob writes. Some foreshadowed the Constitution, and some foreshadowed both. These include, for example, a Grand Council, unicameral as Congress was under the Articles, so a single branch in the legislative, but weighted in representation by state as under the Constitution. So he wanted kind of a general Congress. The executive and legislature were to enjoy enumerated powers only. If you remember what I read, Article 2 expressly delegated powers. And this is the language that they used when they were discussing the powers delegated to the federal government. You can see in the ratification debates, before the Bill of Rights were even considered, they kept saying, like, look, they're only authorized to do the stuff that's been expressly delegated. Even Alexander Hamilton used this phrase, and we know where it comes from. So we have to have this understanding of what that meant in law under the Articles of Confederation to understand what they were referencing when they said such a thing about the Constitution. So the executive and legislature were to enjoy enumerated powers only, as Congress did under the Articles and as the federal government was to receive under the Constitution. More interesting stuff in there as well, kind of connecting Benjamin Franklin's plan of 1754 with the Articles, 1775 and 81, and then the Constitution for the United States. And then I thought this little tidbit was super interesting. And if you've seen my episode covering Franklin's first proposal, you already are familiar with this, but when in 1775, when Franklin introduced his ideas for an Articles of Confederation, he shopped it around. He wanted to see if he could get enough support to get this passed. And we have a copy of we have an annotated copy with Thomas Jefferson's notes. Overall, he really liked it. In letters, he specifically said he thought it was really good, but there's this. He wrote this significant comment. Question: what their mutual and general welfare means. There should be no vague terms in an instrument of this kind. Its objects should be precisely and determinately fixed. So Thomas Jefferson thought the phrase, the legal term, general welfare, was too vague. I don't see anything else in his writing going from there forward to say, maybe he had been convinced by somebody that the legal meaning of this is the legal meaning of this, but at least in 1775 in July, he thought the term general welfare was too vague, and if it was too vague and broad, of course, we know that people with power will always read texts that delegate power to them in the broadest way possible. So he warned about that. And I covered this whole thing, Benjamin Franklin's Articles of Confederation, in an episode July 2022, which I will link to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now back to John Dickinson's 1776 Articles of Confederation. His draft contemplated a looser union than Franklin's. This is from Rob again, but a tighter one than created by the finished article. So, how that all relates to the Constitution, I think it's just interesting. Franklin wanted a little bit more centralized power in his proposal. Dickinson went way looser, but still kind of in between. And we know that they were all more on the federal end, more decentralized end than what the Constitution for the United States. Now, this is interesting as well, and this is from Mike Meharry's article on this. One of his most controversial proposals, at least for that time, was for an end to slavery. Here in 1776, John Dickinson is including a call to completely end slavery. So the idea that everybody was just in love with that horrid institution is absurd, or did nothing about it. Dickinson was a slaveholder, but, Mike writes, he subsequently freed his slaves while he was still alive. In his draft of the Articles of Confederation, again, which was first put out July 12, 1776, he wrote, quote, "Should there not be an article to prevent those who are hereafter brought into these colonies from being held in slavery in these colonies?" So it was a kind of a gradual abolition approach which is what a lot of the abolition societies had done over the next couple of decades there as well. But in this draft of the Articles of Confederation, in his handwriting, we see it as well. He was also the first to use, I guess, what we could call gender inclusive language, specifically his or her. He wrote at one point, it was like his or their, and he crossed it off, and he specifically put his or her. He was very much a Quaker, so that probably is this. But it's also the first substantive provision of an Anglo-American Constitution to use his or her ever. So this was a proposal from John Dickinson that I thought was pretty interesting as well. Now, as I quoted Brian McClanahan earlier in the show, the articles are, he said in his article there in that blog, which you really should check out, and that episode, the Articles of Confederation are almost totally ignored today. And few people know even the most basic thing about the Constitution of the United States. And then on top of it, they really got to understand the Articles. And if you want to understand the Articles, you got to look back at the debates over that, the proposals from Franklin, Dickinson, Thomas Paine, even the Albany Plan to really understand what they were trying to do. And then we can even trace it all the way back and connect this whole genealogy, this lineage, to the 1643 New England Confederation. And Mike Meharry points out, let me pull this up here, we find shades of that New England Confederation in Benjamin Franklin's short hints towards a scheme for uniting the northern colonies, which was used as the starting point for the Albany Plan in 1754. This, in turn, carried over to Franklin's 1775 Articles of Confederation draft. A year later, ideas in Franklin's plan found their way into the first draft of the Articles of Confederation. And, of course, the Articles created the foundation for the Constitution for the United States. And this is the kind of essential, foundational, historical information we work hard every single day to get out to more and more people. Of course, we try to put this stuff into practice through nullification. We try to put these principles into practice through activism today, but we also have to do the historical study so people have a good framework. And nothing helps us reach and teach more people more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you've got a couple extra bucks, I know they're making it very difficult with all the fiat, funny money printing garbage and all the spending that they're doing and all the partisan trash that we get all the time. But if you've got a couple of bucks of that dirty U.S. fiat, throw it our way, and we will use it to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. And I don't think anyone makes so little go so far as us here at the TAC. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm going to look over in the chat a little bit later today or tomorrow. I see a lot of comments. I really appreciate it. Here's a good one. Make America States Again. My friend Joe Wolverton sent me a hat with that on it a little while ago as well. It's a great phrase, and I really appreciate you guys being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I will publish the blog post here for this in a couple hours. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. There's a lot of content here. The hardest part for me putting the notes together on this one was trying to make it narrow so it was still, I could tell a little bit of a story and it was still at least interesting without going through too much date and time stuff, which I think can get a little bit boring. So hopefully you guys found this interesting and hopefully it piqued your interest to learn more. If you want more on this topic, let me know. I will keep doing more episodes. I mean, I'm going to one way or the other, but I guess it depends how many. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.